They thought they could vanish me, bury my name under a grave accusation, and leave me to rot in a cell for decades. They made one fatal mistake. They underestimated exactly who I was before they tried to break me. The sun was beginning to dip behind the sprawling oaks of the city's central park, casting long, amber shadows across the gravel path where I had sought a few minutes of peace. I wasn't there as a woman of position, a name that could move budgets or dissolve departments with a single phone call. I was there as a civilian, wearing a vintage silk dress that caught the evening breeze, a rare indulgence in a life usually defined by sharp suits and armored transport. I had stepped away from my security detail, a decision I would regret within minutes, because for once I wanted to feel like a person, not an icon. I was reaching for a book on the bench when a heavy hand clamped onto my shoulder, jarring me so violently I nearly stumbled into the dirt. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, only to find myself face to face with two officers whose uniforms were ill-fitted and whose expressions were masked by a cocktail of malice and boredom. They didn't ask for identification. They didn't ask what I was doing. They simply demanded that I empty my pockets, claiming reports of suspicious activity in the area. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "But you have no legal basis for this intrusion. I'm a private citizen enjoying a quiet evening, and I suggest you rethink this approach." The younger of the two sneered, his eyes scanning me with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. He reached out again, not to check for credentials, but to snatch the bag hanging from my shoulder. When I pulled back, he lunged. It wasn't a professional restraint. It was an act of aggression. As I braced myself, I felt the sickening sound of fabric ripping. His rough hands had caught the bodice of my silk dress, tearing the seam down the side with a sharp, ugly tear. My breath hitched as I felt exposed, humiliated and utterly enraged. "You're resisting," the older one growled, his hand tightening on his belt, as if he were looking for an excuse to reach for something more than just his handcuffs. "We've got reports of a courier moving restricted packets with substances in this sector. You fit the description, and you're going to cooperate, whether you like it or not." My mind raced. Restricted packets with substances? They were fabricating a narrative, a dangerous fabricated scenario to justify their conduct. It was a classic move by a rogue unit, turning a random citizen into a target to pad their statistics or settle some dark quota. They were setting me up for a grave accusation, a path that could lead to me being buried under a massive sentence. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know that the very legislation they were supposedly enforcing had been drafted under my oversight. They didn't know that my legal team was already monitoring my location, even if I had tried to go off the grid for an hour. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, stepping back as the younger officer prepared to pin me against a tree. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. If you touch me again, you aren't just looking at a complaint. You are looking at the end of your careers, and possibly a very long time in a cell of your own." The older officer let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that sounded like a bark. He reached out, grabbing my wrist with a grip like iron, and shoved me toward the park's service exit, where a nondescript, unmarked van was idling in the twilight. The air grew cold. I looked around, desperate for a witness, but the park was strangely empty, as if someone had ensured the perimeter was clear for this exact confrontation. "Nobody is coming to save you, lady," the older officer whispered, his face inches from mine, smelling of cheap coffee and hostility. "And after we find the evidence we're about to plant in your pockets, you won't have a status left to talk about. You'll be just another convict lost in the system." As he forced me toward the back of the van, the heavy sliding door creaked open, revealing a dark, cavernous space that promised nothing but isolation. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I realized then that this wasn't just a random harassment. This was an orchestrated play, a setup designed to vanish me. Just as he shoved me forward, I caught a glint of movement in the reflection of a nearby puddle, a red laser dot dancing across the back of the officer's jacket. My phone, hidden deep in the remains of my dress, vibrated with a singular high-priority alert. My team had finally bypassed the jamming signal. But as I braced myself for the shove, the van's interior light flickered on, revealing not just empty space, but a crate marked with the insignias of a banned extremist group, meant to ensure my guilt was absolute. I looked up at the officer's smug, cruel face, and knew that if I didn't act within the next 3 seconds, my life as I knew it would cease to exist. I took a deep breath, prepared to reveal my identity. But just as I opened my mouth, a black sedan screeched around the corner, its sirens cutting through the air like a scream. The screech of tires wasn't the sound of police sirens, it was the sound of a tactical entry. The black sedan slammed to a halt, boxing in the van and the 2 officers. Doors flew open in unison, and before the officers could even reach for their holsters, they were swarmed by 4 men in tactical gear that screamed federal intervention. These weren't patrol officers. These were members of the agency that oversaw the very people currently trying to ruin my life. "Drop your weapons. Hands behind your heads now!" the lead agent barked, his voice echoing through the darkening park. The 2 men who had been manhandling me turned pale, their arrogance vanishing in a heartbeat. They were like cornered animals, eyes darting around as they realized the scale of the trap they had walked into. I stood in the middle of the path, my torn dress hanging precariously, my pulse still hammering in my ears. The lead agent didn't look at me yet. He kept his eyes locked on the 2 officers, his hand resting firmly on his sidearm. "You're making a mistake," the older officer spat, his voice shaking. "We're in the middle of a delicate operation. We have intel on a high-level courier transporting banned substances. You're interfering with a sanctioned investigation." The lead agent stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't blink. "You are interfering with a sensitive perimeter established by the Office of the Undersecretary. You aren't investigating anything. You're being processed for your role in a massive coordinated corruption scheme, and you're currently standing on grounds that are under direct surveillance by the Internal Security Department." The color drained from the younger officer's face. He looked at me, then at the agents, and finally at the van. He knew. They were part of a larger network, an organized scheme designed to clear out political obstacles, and they had just targeted the wrong person. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, disarming the 2 men and dragging them away from the van. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw one of the agents pull a sealed plastic bag from the crate inside the van, a bag filled with illegal substances they had clearly intended to plant on me. "Ma'am," the lead agent said, finally turning his attention to me. His expression was stern, bordering on apologetic. "I am Agent Vance. We have been tracking this cell for weeks. We knew they were planning a move tonight, but we didn't expect them to be foolish enough to strike at you." I straightened my shoulders, pulling the remnants of my dress together. "They weren't just being foolish, Agent. They were being directed. Look at their equipment. Look at their logistics. This wasn't a patrol officer's whim. Someone gave them the order to intercept me specifically." Vance's jaw tightened. He signaled to his team, who began photographing the scene with methodical precision. "We're aware. That's why you're coming with us. This park is no longer secure." As they escorted me toward the black sedan, the older officer, the one who had torn my dress, let out a hollow, manic laugh. He was being pushed into a separate vehicle, his face twisted into a mask of pure defiance. "You think you won," he shouted across the path. "You're just one person in a system that's already rotting from the top down. You might have friends in high places, but wait until you see who else is on the payroll." This wasn't the end. It was just the prologue. I ignored him, sliding into the back of the sedan. The leather was cold, smelling of ozone and professional detachment. As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the park. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, and for a split second, I saw a flash of light from the tree line. A camera lens, or perhaps something more dangerous. "Agent Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the car. "What exactly were they planning to do once they had me in that van?" Vance didn't answer immediately. He stared ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They weren't just going to arrest you, ma'am. They had orders to initiate an immediate transfer to a black site. They were going to frame you for a massive multi-state illegal operation, providing enough fabricated evidence to ensure you were buried under a mountain of heavy charges and impossible to reach for years." My blood ran cold. "And who would have been in charge of that transfer?" Vance took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. That's the problem. The paperwork for the transfer wasn't signed by a local precinct. It came from a digital signature linked to the very office that reports to your department. I sat frozen, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't external, it was internal. Someone within my own inner circle, someone with access to my schedule and my security protocols, had fed this information to the organized scheme. As I began to process the implications, the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes, causing the sedan to skid sideways across the wet asphalt. A massive truck, unmarked and missing its plates, had swerved directly into our path, blocking the narrow access road. From the darkness surrounding the truck, a dozen men dressed in tactical gear, their faces hidden by masks, poured out. But these weren't federal agents. They were professional, armed with high-caliber equipment, and they moved with a military precision that chilled my soul. "Down!" Vance shouted, reaching for his weapon, but a deafening explosion shattered the passenger side window, turning the cabin into a storm of glass and smoke. As the airbags deployed and the world tilted into chaos, I saw a familiar silhouette step out from behind the truck. Someone I had seen in my office just that morning, holding a cup of coffee and wishing me a pleasant evening. The realization was more devastating than the ambush. The air inside the cabin was thick with the acrid metallic tang of an airbag that had just saved my life, or perhaps merely delayed the inevitable. I pushed the deflating fabric away, my ears ringing with a high-pitched, relentless whine. Through the shattered window, the scene outside was a nightmare of controlled chaos. Agent Vance was slumped over the center console, blood trickling from a shallow graze on his temple, his hand still clutching his weapon. I didn't panic. I couldn't. I had spent 15 years in the halls of power, navigating political minefields where a single misspoken word could end a career. This was just a more violent version of that game. I reached into the wreckage of the car, found Vance's radio, and tucked it into the hidden pocket of my ruined dress. Outside, the silhouette I had recognized stood calm, unmoved by the chaos. It was Marcus, my chief of staff. The man who had managed my life, screened my calls, and sat in on every closed-door session of the past 5 years. He was adjusting his cufflinks, looking at the totaled sedan with the detached curiosity of a man examining a broken clock. He wasn't there to rescue me. He was there to close the loop. "Clear the debris," Marcus ordered, his voice crisp and devoid of any human warmth. "Find the drive she carries in her bag. The rest, well, the scene needs to look like a tragic accident involving an extremist cell attack. Ensure the evidence from the van is planted appropriately in the vehicle wreckage." The men began moving toward us. I knew I had seconds. My training, years of executive protection drills that I had once thought were just tedious requirements, kicked in. I looked at Vance. He groaned, eyes fluttering open. "Vance," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up. We need to move." He blinked, confusion clouding his vision before the reality of the ambush hit him. He saw Marcus outside and his face hardened. "He's the leak," Vance breathed, his voice barely audible over the crackle of distant fires. "They're not here to interrogate us. They're here to erase the evidence of the organized scheme." "I know," I replied. I reached over to the glove compartment, feeling for the emergency override switch that every official high-security vehicle possessed. My fingers brushed cold metal. I flipped the latch. A secondary communication channel blinked to life, a direct encrypted uplink to the central office of the Internal Security Department. I didn't have time to explain. I just keyed the mic and left it open, allowing the sounds of the struggle to broadcast live. "They're coming for us," I whispered to Vance, then pulled my legs tight, preparing to burst from the door the moment they breached the perimeter. Marcus walked right up to the driver's side, peering through the glass. He didn't look like an assassin. He looked like a weary civil servant. "You always were too curious for your own good," he murmured, loud enough for me to hear through the broken frame. "The organization requires stability, and you, with your crusade for transparency, were a tectonic shift we couldn't afford. Did you really think you could tear down a structure that has been built into the foundation of this city for decades?" I didn't respond. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small, heavy piece of metal, a tactical keycard used to access the emergency vaults, and gripped it like a blade. As the nearest gunman pried at the door with a crowbar, The metal shrieked against the frame. "Open the door!" the gunman shouted. I waited until the lock snapped. As the door swung outward, I didn't cower. I slammed my shoulder into it, pinning the gunman against the frame, and drove the keycard into the sensitive gap of his tactical vest. He collapsed with a wheeze. I didn't stop. I scrambled over Vance, pulling his weapon from his holster, and dove into the dark brush alongside the road. "Find her!" Marcus roared, his calm facade shattering into raw, jagged fury. "If she gets to a terminal, the whole network falls. Kill her if you have to, but get that data." I sprinted through the undergrowth, the rough bark of trees tearing at my skin, and the remnants of my silk dress. My lungs burned, but I could hear them crashing through the brush behind me. They were gaining. I stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor, the breath knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping, I saw something that stopped my heart. Ahead of me, the woods opened up into a clearing, and there, parked in the shadows of the trees, was a vehicle I recognized instantly. It was a black transport, unmarked, but with the distinctive, low-profile modifications of the very team that had sworn to protect me from the start. But the men standing by the vehicle weren't my team. They were wearing uniforms of the local police, the same precinct that had harassed me earlier. The circle was closing. I had nowhere left to run. The internal security department hadn't sent a response yet, and Marcus was less than 50 yards behind me. I looked at the weapon in my hand, then back at the clearing. I was trapped between an assassin I knew and a force I no longer recognized. Then, a low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the ground, growing louder with every heartbeat, a sound that could only mean one thing. A helicopter was approaching, and it wasn't coming from the government side. The rhythmic thumping of rotor blades grew into a roar that shook the very ground beneath me. I pressed my back against the rough trunk of an ancient oak, my heart drumming a frantic counter-rhythm to the descending machine. Through the dense canopy, I saw the blinding wash of a high-intensity searchlight sweep across the clearing, effectively pinning Marcus's gunmen to the spot. They dropped their weapons, shielding their faces as the helicopter's downwash sent dust and debris into a chaotic vortex. This wasn't an official tactical extraction. The helicopter was matte black, devoid of any government markings or standard registration codes. It belonged to the private sector, to the very shadow players I had spent my entire career trying to expose. Marcus stood in the center of the clearing, his hands raised not in surrender, but in a strange gesture of welcome. He wasn't terrified. He was waiting. My phone, tucked safely in the lining of my dress, buzzed incessantly. A message flashed on the screen. "Do not move. The third party has arrived. We are compromised." It was a warning from the internal security department. Even they were backing down. The level of rot was deeper than I had ever dared to imagine. It wasn't just my chief of staff. It was the entire infrastructure of the city's power grid, the judiciary, and the private contractors who operated in the blind spots of the law. One of the gunmen turned his head, his eyes scanning the tree line, clearly looking for me. "She's here somewhere," he screamed over the roar of the rotors. "Find her before they start the retrieval." I didn't wait. I moved silently, slipping through the brush toward the periphery of the clearing, hoping to circle back to the road. Every movement felt like a gamble with my life. I reached the edge of the woods and found myself at the embankment of a deep, concrete drainage canal. It was my only path to the underground utility tunnels, the only place where I could potentially find a secure terminal to upload the incriminating data I had been gathering for months. I slid down the embankment, the mud soaking through my ruined silk, and scrambled into the dark, echoing maw of the tunnel. It was freezing, the air stagnant, and thick with the smell of damp concrete and rust. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, and started running. My footsteps echoed with terrifying clarity. Behind me, I heard the crunch of gravel and the metallic click of a weapon being readied. "I know you're in there," a voice called out. It wasn't Marcus. It was deeper, colder. A voice I had only heard in intercepted audio files related to the organized scheme. "You have the files, and you have nowhere to run. You think you're the hero of this story, but in the end, history is written by those who survive the night. And you're just a page we're tearing out of the book." I didn't stop. I reached a junction in the tunnels, where a series of heavy, rusted pipes marked the main artery of the city's server infrastructure. I slammed my hand against the wall, finding the hidden panel I had studied in the blueprints years ago. My fingers trembled as I typed in the access code. The panel hissed, revealing a backlit console that flickered to life. I pulled the drive from my bag and jammed it into the port. A loading bar appeared on the screen. Data transfer in progress. But the progress bar was agonizingly slow. 10%. 15%. Found her! A voice echoed from the tunnel entrance behind me. I spun around, pointing the empty service weapon I had taken from the sedan, praying they wouldn't realize it had only one round left. A man stepped out from the darkness, his face obscured by a tactical visor. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a hunter who knew the prey was trapped. "Step away from the console," he commanded, his weapon leveled at my chest. "I have the evidence of the organized scheme uploaded to a dead man's switch," I lied, my voice steady, despite the sheer terror radiating through my limbs. "If I don't enter the override code every 60 seconds, it broadcasts to every major news outlet in the country. You kill me, you destroy everything you've built." The man hesitated. He checked his watch, then looked at the console. He was debating if I was bluffing. The transfer hit 40%. Suddenly, the lights in the tunnel flickered and died. A total blackout. The only light came from the glowing green progress bar on the console. "You're not bluffing," the man murmured, his visor reflecting the flickering green light, "but you're also not going to win." He raised his weapon, but before he could pull the trigger, the entire tunnel groaned. A massive vibration shuddered through the walls, and the concrete ceiling began to buckle. A muffled explosion sounded from above. The helicopter was detonating the surface access points, effectively sealing us inside. "What are you doing?" the man screamed, his composure finally breaking. "They aren't here to capture me," I realized, the horror dawning on me. "They're here to bury us both." The console beeped, a sharp, shrill sound. "Transfer, 85%, 86%. The man lunged at me, his hand reaching for the console. I tackled him, the two of us crashing into the cold, wet concrete. We wrestled for control, his strength far superior to mine, but I was fueled by a rage that defied exhaustion. My hand found a loose bolt on the floor, a jagged piece of metal, and I didn't hesitate. I drove it into his shoulder, and as he roared in pain, I scrambled back toward the console. The progress bar hit 99%. Then, a red warning flashed on the screen. Security breach detected. Remote shutdown initiated. The screen went black. I stared at it, frozen, as the sound of the ceiling collapsing grew deafening. The man stood up, clutching his shoulder, a sadistic grin spreading across his face. "Too late," he whispered. "The system is rewriting itself. Your evidence is gone, and so are we." At that exact moment, the tunnel floor began to split open, not from the collapsing ceiling, but from beneath. A hiss of steam erupted from the pipes, and a mechanical metallic hand, part of an automated maintenance unit, slammed through the floor, grabbing the man by the throat and dragging him into the darkness of the sub-level pipes. I stood alone in the dark, the console dead, the exit blocked by tons of concrete, and a voice, not human, but synthesized and cold, began to speak from the tunnel's speaker system. "Access denied. Initiating total system purge." The synthesized voice wasn't a threat, it was a ghost. As the final echo of the purge warning vibrated through the tunnel, I realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that the system was programmed to destroy the evidence, but it couldn't destroy a witness who had been trained in the very architecture of its logic. The purge was an automated script, but I knew the source code better than the people who had built it. I didn't reach for the weapon. I reached for the manual override port hidden beneath the console's base. With a surge of desperation, I pried the panel loose, revealing a mess of fiber optic cables that pulsated with a faint, rhythmic blue light. This wasn't just a server, it was the heart of the organized scheme's communication network. I didn't need to upload the files to a remote server. I needed to dump them directly into the city's primary utility grid, which was currently being monitored by every major news outlet in the state, waiting for the press conference that was supposed to have happened 3 hours ago. "Initiate bypass," I whispered to the interface. The console sputtered, the screen flickering back to life. A progress bar appeared, but this time it wasn't a percentage. It was a destination. Target, public broadcast frequency. Above me, the tunnel walls began to groan under the weight of the surface explosions, but I held my position. The man I had fought was gone, dragged into the abyss of the sub-levels, leaving me alone with the machine. Transfer complete, the screen flashed. I didn't wait for a celebration. I turned and sprinted toward the only remaining exit, a maintenance shaft that led to the city's drainage network. I climbed, my muscles screaming in protest, the silk of my dress finally giving way completely as I hauled myself up the rusted rungs. When I finally broke the surface, I emerged in a quiet, industrial alleyway, miles from the park, just as the city's massive digital billboards shifted. The advertisements for high-end fashion and real estate vanished. In their place, a single flickering image appeared. A digital ledger, time-stamped and verified, documenting the entire organized scheme. It was all there, the bribes, the illegal shipments, the names of the officials who had traded their integrity for shadow influence. Even from the alley, I could hear the distant, growing roar of the city. People were stopping their cars, stepping out of buildings, and looking up at the sky. The truth wasn't just a whisper. It was a tidal wave. My phone finally stopped buzzing. The secure line from the internal security department had gone silent, but a new message appeared. We have them. All of them. Get to a safe house. The cleanup begins now. I walked out of the alley, my hair matted with mud, my dress in tatters, looking like a survivor of a war zone. I didn't hide. I walked straight toward the main plaza where a group of patrol officers, the ones who hadn't been part of the scheme, were standing in shock, staring at the billboards. They turned to me, their hands hovering near their holsters, but when they saw who I was, their expressions shifted from suspicion to stunned recognition. The lead officer took a step forward, his voice trembling. "Ma'am, you need medical attention." "I don't need a medic," I said, my voice cutting through the growing chaos of the crowd. "I need you to arrest the man who is currently standing at the edge of the plaza, waiting for his private transport to get him out of the city." I pointed toward a black sedan idling near the curb. Marcus stood there, his phone pressed to his ear, his face white as a sheet as he watched his own life's work being broadcast to the world. He turned, locked eyes with me, and the mask finally broke. He looked not like a mastermind, but like a small, pathetic man, caught in the machinery of his own greed. The officers didn't hesitate. They swarmed the car before Marcus could even reach the door. I watched as they dragged him out, pinning him to the hood of his own vehicle. He didn't fight back. He just stared at me, his gaze full of venomous defeat. The scandal didn't stop that night. It triggered a decade of investigations, a total restructuring of the city's governance, and the end of the organized scheme that had held us all hostage. I returned to my office a week later. The halls were different, quiet, respectful, and filled with people who were genuinely afraid of the power of transparency. I sat at my desk, the same one where Marcus had stood just days before, and looked at the pen he had left behind. I picked it up, opened the window to let in the morning air, and threw it into the trash. I had learned that status wasn't about the title on your door, or the security detail that trailed you. It was about the ability to look at the shadows and decide that they were no longer welcome. As I looked out over the city, I knew that the path ahead would be difficult, and the rebuild would be slow. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't just an icon. I was the one who had finally turned the lights on, and I wasn't planning on ever letting them flicker again. The era of the unreachable was over. The era of accountability had begun. And as the city woke up beneath me, I knew that no matter what happened next, I was finally, truly free.